Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another ABF session. We are working through a section that I'm calling Old Testament Pieces to the End Times Puzzle. Basically, what we're doing is looking back through the Old Testament and trying to figure out, okay, what is the main thrust of the storyline of Israel in the Old Testament, and how does that set us up for our understanding of what's going to happen in the end times? And in order to do that, we have got to talk about covenants, agreements, promises. Because ultimately what we know about the end times is what God has promised will happen in fulfillment of the promises that he has made in the Old Testament, and also, I would say, too, in the New Testament. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But first, we're talking about the Old Testament. And what I've done is I've talked about one or two, actually at this point, two major covenants that God makes with his people Israel in the Old Testament. And I've kind of summarized it on the board here behind me. And this right here is going to sort of lay out a little bit of a review of what we've talked about over the last few weeks. The Abrahamic Covenant is the first one that we've talked about. And you'll notice I have some notes, kind of review notes on this section. I wanted to summarize in my own head the main points of what we've talked about so far, and I'm going to talk it through on the board, but you have a lot of this printed on the notes, but I'm not going to refer to those notes. I'm just going to review what I have here on the board. And before I do that, let me remind you that I have some brand new notes for the next two Sundays, August 9th and August 16th. I've got those notes already up on the website, fbchh.org, under the Resources tab. You'll notice ABF notes, and it should pop right up. And you should see, like I said, these two opening paragraphs of these two opening sections with no blanks to fill in, just to review the main ideas of the Abrahamic Covenant. Okay? So let's dive right into this. Abrahamic Covenant. God made a promise to Abraham. I should say a series of promises. These promises took the form of an official covenant or an agreement or a contract, you could say, between Abraham and all of his descendants and God. And this was intended to be an eternal covenant. In other words, to last forever. It's not just a 30-year covenant or a 300-year covenant or a 3,000-year covenant. It starts with Abraham, and it's intended to run on into eternity, to never expire. There's no expiration date on it. And another thing we talked about, too, is that the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. What that means is that it's not dependent on the behavior of anybody in the covenant except for God. So God makes this agreement with Abraham, and he says, look, if you leave your family and friends and your hometown and head off to the promised land, I will do this, and I will do this, and I will do this. Well, Abraham did that. He left. He went off to travel in Canaan. Now, we know that he had a lot of failures along the way. He made a lot of mistakes. He wasn't perfect to his side of the covenant. He made all kinds of dumb decisions, and his children went on to make all kinds of dumb decisions. But God made it clear in the way he made the contract from the beginning that the onus or the weight or the responsibility for fulfilling the promises of the Abrahamic Covenant rests solely 100% on God's shoulders. In other words, it's not like I have to measure up to my part, and if I do my part, then God will do his part. No, that the part that humanity already had to do has already been done by Abraham. He left his family's home by faith and walked with God. Now, the covenant in perpetuity is an unconditional, eternal covenant. And no matter what Abraham's kids and descendants and great-grandkids and all the way down to the common times do, God is going to fulfill his promises. Now, what are those promises? You can sum it up in three big concepts, all right? First, we have the land. That's the first promise of the Abrahamic Covenant. There's going to be a land, a homeland for Abraham and his descendants. They'll be able to live in, and they'll be able to live in it forever, okay, the land. The second part is descendants, because you remember when God made the promise to Abraham, Abraham had no children at all. Later on, he had Ishmael in a way that God didn't approve of, and God was still holding out for Isaac, his second-born son, who would eventually be the one through whom the rest of the promises would come true. But God said to Abraham, look, I'm going to give you so many descendants, the stars in the sky are easier to count than how many kids you're going to have. The sand, the individual grains of sand on the seashore will be easier to count than lining up all of your descendants and trying to count them. God is going to give you, Abraham, Abraham a multitude of descendants, and these descendants will be linked together in a nation. They'll have a common identity, which later on became known as the children of Israel. And then the third thing God says, the third promise that he promises to fulfill through the Abrahamic Covenant is this idea of blessing. And the blessing is twofold. One are blessings to Israel. The blessings of obedience, that God will protect them, God will make their name great, God will give them everything that they need, they'll have an abundance. But also, he says, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So the blessing's not just for obedient Israel. The blessing is for obedient Israel and also the rest of the world through whom God intends, and Israel is the method by which God intends to pass the blessing on to the entire world. This is how God is going to redeem the planet that has run away from him and has been corrupted and has been turned aside. He's going to use the nation of Israel. He's going to bless them, and by blessing them, they're going to then spread that blessing to the rest of the world. Now, no matter what happens after Abraham, this unconditional promise has been sort of like this huge umbrella under which all the rest of the Old Testament is sort of like huddled underneath it. Okay? And underneath that, though, God came back, and we talked about this the last couple of weeks. God made additional covenants, kind of like sub-covenants, that help to further flesh out and explain and describe the dynamic of the Abrahamic Covenant. And the one we've already talked about, and we're going to get to the second one today, the one we've already talked about is called the Mosaic Covenant. And I put it over here underneath the land. Why is it underneath the land? It's a sub-covenant to help explain the whole deal with God giving the land to the children of Israel. Because the Mosaic Covenant, I made the argument last week, is a lease agreement between God and the Israelites. And the lease is over the land. This covenant, this law, this arrangement with duties and obligations for Israel and for God. These things are what you will have to live up to, Israel, if you want to stay in the land that I'm giving you. This is the behavior that is expected of you in order to please me and keep me happy so that I don't kick you out of the land that I had promised to you. Got it? So like, I own a house. If I want you to live in it, or if you want to live in it, you sign an agreement, a lease agreement. If you violate the terms of the lease agreement, I have the right to kick you out of the house. That's the same thing going on here with the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant was put in place as a conditional lease agreement. And in this conditional lease agreement, you have blessings for obedience and you have curses for disobedience. Now, the blessings for obedience are substantial. Right? We talked about this. There's health, there's prosperity, there's abundance, there's satisfaction of all your needs, there's protection from your enemies, there's majesty and power and glory. Like, you're going to be at the head of the group of nations, not at the tail of the group of nations. You are going to be an influential, significant force to be reckoned with in the world. Those are the blessings of obedience. And we'll notice, and throughout Israel's history, the times when she did obey God, God blessed her with these blessings of obedience. However, there were also curses for disobedience, right? The curses for disobedience were, as much as God devoted energy to blessing you when you're obedient, God will devote that much energy to punishing you and causing grief and pain to come into your life because of your disobedience to him. And remember, the key requirement of the Mosaic law, right, is loyalty. It's unconditional loyalty to me. It's exclusive loyalty. It's don't share your affections between me and some other God and think that I'm going to be okay with it. God is saying, no. The curses for disobedience are significant. There'll be destruction. There'll be punishments. There'll be invasions. And ultimately, if you continue to go in idolatry and you don't listen to the warnings and you don't come back to God, the ultimate promise, the ultimate curse to be exile. You're going to be kicked out of the land, right? Because if you break the lease agreement enough times, finally, the owner is going to foreclose on you and the owner is going to send you out. They're going to kick you to the curb. And that's exactly what Moses warned Israel would happen. Now, the truth part of the story, or the rest of the story, you could say, is that is exactly how things turned out. Israel continued in their idolatry. They continued to abandon God. And every now and then they would turn around. God would send a prophet, or God would send a king, or God would send a judge. And the people would be like, yay, we love God again. And then a few years later, they would turn away again. And so you have this constant betrayal and abandonment of God. And in the process, Moses warns them, hey, someday you're going to go too far, and God is going to invoke the exile clause. And when God invokes the exile clause, you will be kicked out of the land. And that happens in 586 BC. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, if you remember the story from Daniel, conquers Jerusalem and just obliterates and destroys the city. He destroys the temple, he destroys the outer walls, and he carries all the people away into captivity. So this was fulfilled. In fact, a lot of the Old Testament, Ezra, Nehemiah, Jeremiah, I'm trying to think some of the other ones, Ezekiel, some of these other books, prophetic books in the Bible, describe the people living in exile. And Moses said, if you're in exile, he said, this is what's going to happen. At some point, you're going to repent. And at some point, you're going to return to God. You're going to confess your sins, and you're going to clear that up between you and God. And that's a good thing. That's what God intended. But then we also find if you repent, God promises as a result, I will take you back to the land. I will return you to the place that I kicked you out of. In other words, kicking you out of the land was not forever. It was a temporary punishment to wake you up to your spiritual need so you would come back to me in your hearts. And when you do that, I'll let you go back to the land. And the idea is that not only would you return to the land, but then God says, I'm going to do something inside of you so that the laws you have to obey from the Mosaic Covenant aren't just these external rules you have to live by, but you will from the heart be transformed. And from the heart, you will obey and you will desire God. You will love him. You will choose to do the right thing from the inside out. Why? Because your hearts have been transformed and your heart have been healed. And then God says, when that happens, when your hearts are transformed, then I'm going to give you back the kingdom, and I'm going to give you back all the blessings of prosperity and abundance that you once had before. So that's basically what Israel is waiting for. That's what Israel is hoping for. We have the exile, like I said, happening in 586 BC with King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, taking the children away into exile. While in exile, the children of Israel repent, they confess their sins, and God does send them back to the land. In fact, King Cyrus, the very first king of the Persian era, he issues this proclamation throughout all of his kingdom saying, any Jew that wants to go back to rebuild the temple and to start life again, you're welcome to go back. But there's a couple of key things that go unfulfilled in this prophecy that Moses gives in the Mosaic Covenant. Two pieces, yes, they're fulfilled. The people are back in the land. But here's a problem. They continue to struggle with sin. If you read the books, I think it's of Haggai, and if you read the book of Zechariah, and you read the book of Malachi, just those three books, they're minor prophets that live in the land after the exile is over and the children have returned. What you realize is the children of Israel are still messing up. They're still breaking the law. They're still not able to live up to the lease agreement. And basically, they're on target for another exile clause at some point, or maybe complete destruction, who knows? And so they keep calling the people back because here's the deal. There has not been an internal transformation. There's been no change on the inside. They're still there, they're still in the land, and they still have the opportunity to obey these laws from the outside, but their hearts don't seem capable of sticking with it for very long. So this part of the prophecy was unfulfilled. And then also, especially this last one, the restoration of a kingdom is unfulfilled. Because when they come back from the land, they're not coming back, from exile, they're not coming back to the land as conquering kings, and now they have an opportunity to live independently and free and do whatever they want to do. No, they're vassals or under kings or under the authority of the Persian kings. Later on, that goes to the Syrian kings. After the Syrians, there's a little bit of independence, and then after the independence of that, then all of a sudden they get conquered by Rome again. And And so for hundreds more years, the children of Israel are in the land, but they are not able to enjoy the kingdom. They're slaves. They're occupied territories of other empires, foreign empires, empires that don't know God, don't respect him, don't follow him. And so there's this ache inside of the people of Israel. As you get into the end of the Old Testament era and you move into the New Testament era, there's this ache inside of them for these final two promises to be fulfilled. And then, tell you what, the prophets, they just make it worse. The prophets make it worse. How do the prophets make it worse? The prophets start to make the suggestion, and this is at the very end of your recap section under Mosaic Covenant. It says, the prophets suggested that it would happen with the return of a very special figure, a person, an individual, a leader who would bring the rest of the blessings that they were waiting for. So, in other words, they came to believe in their minds, based on what the prophets were telling them in Isaiah and Jeremiah and other places, that the reason these two things had not been fulfilled yet, especially the restoration of the kingdom, the reason they were still enslaved to foreign powers, the reason they were still unable to consistently obey God and not sin and break the law all the time, was because there was someone who was coming. And that person who was coming would, in that moment, during his lifetime, he would fix these last two problems and fulfill these last two prophecies. And then from there, usher Israel back into the place she always wanted to be, which is, of course, to be with a kingdom in the land, obeying God and enjoying God's blessings. That's what Israel has always wanted. But reality is saying it hasn't happened yet. So they were saying, okay, there's somebody who's coming. And they came to call this person the Messiah, which means the one who is anointed. Okay? And this takes us now, we got to go backtrack a little bit in Israel's history, because we haven't talked about this idea of king and kingdom and kingship. It's a really important theme throughout the entire Old Testament. And if you miss out on this, you'll not only misunderstand the Old Testament, which is a crime. You should love the Old Testament and enjoy it. But you'll also misunderstand and miss out on what's going on with Jesus and what's the deal with his ministry and his mission and his identity, okay? So we got to talk about kings and kingdoms today. And in order to do that, I want to talk about a second sub-covenant underneath the Abrahamic Covenant. So we've already talked about the Mosaic Covenant. That's a lease agreement about the land and the people, how they ought to behave while in the land. Next, I'm going to talk to you about what I'm calling, and here's the first set of blanks here, the Davidic Covenant. Davidic Covenant, which basically is God making promises to a man by the name of David. So Davidic, first blank, David, second blank. And in order for this covenant to make sense, I need to give you a little bit of historical context, okay? Open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 49. Genesis chapter 49. I want to point something out to you. All the way back in the beginning, Genesis 49, which is the life of Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson. Okay? And Jacob is really the one who gives birth, in a sense, to the larger identity of the nation of Israel. He has 12 sons. These 12 sons go down into Egypt later. They multiply, and then they come back as this unified nation around 12 different tribes. That all comes from Jacob, and he was nicknamed, actually, he was renamed by God Israel near the end of his life. And when he moved down to Egypt, and he had all of his sons with him, and it seemed like God was going to bless them and help them to avoid the horrible famine that was in the land, and they were going to survive, they were going to make it. Jacob, right before he died, on his deathbed, gave prophecies about his 12 sons. And these are things that he was apparently revealed to him by God to share with his sons as a form of blessing them and letting them know a little bit about what the future held for them and for their tribes. And what you come to is a really interesting thing when he's talking to his son, Judah, or I should say about his son, Judah. He says something that I think is really important. Take a look at Genesis 49, verses 8, 9, and 10. It says this: Judah, who was his fourth son, by the way, fourth out of 12. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? Look at verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So what is Jacob saying to his son Judah in this scenario? He's basically saying, you are going to be the ruler over all of your brothers. It says all your brothers will come and bow down to you. And then he actually says, the scepter will not depart from the tribe of Judah. Okay? The scepter. What's a scepter? A scepter is a sign of kingship. It's a sign that you have the authority. It's a sign that you are the appointed one to rule the people. So even as far back as Genesis 49, God makes it very clear, and here's the first blank under this section that I want you to have under the historical context, is that God always intended for his people to be ruled by a king from the tribe of Judah. Okay? So king, the idea of a king, that is not new. Right? That has been a part of the story almost going all the way back to the beginning, to Genesis 49. If you remember going all the way back to Abraham, at one point God says to him, I think in chapter 17, he says, kings shall come forth from you. So in other words, this idea of the people having a king was not something that just popped into their heads randomly. God had said, going as far back as Jacob, that he always intended for the people of Israel to be ruled one day by a king, and that king ought to come from the tribe of Judah. Why? Because the scepter will never, how does he say it here in verse 10? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, or the ruler's staff from between his feet. Must have been some kind of a staff that they would hold as a sign of respect and a sign of authority. So that's always the way it was meant to be. Kings was always the way God was going to go about doing it. Then when you get later on into the Mosaic Covenant, in the book of Deuteronomy, which we've talked about at length under the Mosaic Covenant, what you find is that Moses leaves behind some instructions, okay? That's the next set of blanks here. The Mosaic Covenant included instructions for how the king needed to rule the land in order to please God and meet the requirements of the lease agreement. In other words, these kings, as they ruled the people in the land, the kings were responsible to help the people keep the lease agreement, right? They're like sort of like the people who live on the ground floor, right? Who are trying to help the other tenants to keep their tenants' lease. They're the supervisors, right? They're the soups that are there on the bottom floor trying to help everybody else to keep the lease agreement so everybody can stay in the land and the owner doesn't have to bulldoze the house down, right? So these were the kings, and God had specific instructions for them. If you look in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, which we don't have time to talk about now, but I did talk about at great length when we were talking about Solomon and David back, oh gosh, probably a year and a half ago. Deuteronomy 17, he says, look, you got to do a couple things. You have to not multiply treasures for yourself, not multiply wives for yourself. You can't put your trust in your weapons. You can't put your trust in your armies. You need to make a handwritten copy of the Mosaic Covenant, and you're supposed to read from it and memorize it and know it and let it be your guide for how to rule. So God had all these expectations for kings, which shows me that way before the people thought of having a king, God had already planned in his wisdom to use kings to rule over his people, Israel. Now, you guys know a little bit of the story, but let me just kind of recap it for you first, okay? Next blank here, the next statement. There's a couple of blanks to fill in. Who was the first king of Israel? Okay, we know him as Saul, okay? S-A-U-L. He was the first king of Israel, but if you remember the story, he did not represent the choice of God. He wasn't who God wanted to be the king. He was the one that the people wanted. In fact, that's what the blank is right there. He represented the people's choice, not God's choice. Right? The people come to Samuel, who's the prophet at that time, and say, Samuel, hey buddy, your sons are not great men. They're horrible. We don't want them to rule over us as judges someday, like you're ruling over us. We like you, Samuel. You're a good guy. You follow the law. You do what God says. You're somebody who's honorable and decent and has good character. Your sons are losers. We do not want them to take your place when you die. So here's what we want. We want you to speed up the program, and we want you to give us a king right now. Because we're in trouble. We've got the Philistines coming in to give us problems. We got all these outside enemies. We need a king like all the other nations have, and so on and so forth. And God is not happy with this. God is frustrated. Why? Because God in his head has a plan for when he's going to transition the country to a kingship. And if you remember, he's already indicated what tribe this king is going to come from, right? It's Judah. He's already indicated what kind of instruction. So God does have the kingship thing in the back of his mind, but in God's mind, it's not right now, and it's not this guy. Why? Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was chosen because he was 12 inches taller than everybody else, and he was a good-looking man. Okay, those were the job descriptions. He looked the part of a king. He probably looked dashing in like a robe, a kingly robe, and he probably looked really good in a crown and with a sword by his side. He looked the part, but God knew he wasn't ready. But either way, God sometimes, and this is an interesting lesson in life, sometimes God punishes us by giving us what we want, by giving us what we ask for, to prove to us that maybe, just maybe next time, you should hit the brakes a little bit when you have something you really, 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 really want. Maybe you should just calm down a little bit, just hit the pause button, and just let God be in charge of those kinds of things. Anyway, he gives him Saul. And for like 5 minutes, Saul does a good job. He starts to win some battles. He seems to be a humble dude. And then something starts to go wrong. And he goes out on a mission for God to fight against this army. And instead of killing the entire army and destroying all of their spoil and provisions, as God told him to, he decides to keep some of the best of the stuff for himself. And he keeps the king alive, the opposing king of the other army. He brings him back, probably to show him off to his people, probably to humiliate him. The common practice at the time was to torture and to kill these guys after they've sort of been made sport of in front of their people. Okay, so Saul's kept a hold of the king because he wants to prove to everybody, look, see, I was able to conquer him and his whole army. And he disobeys God. And God's had enough. And Samuel comes to Saul and says, hey, Saul, here's what's happening. You aren't cut out for this job. Yes, the people wanted you to be king, and I listened to the people. But you know what? That's a bad idea. That's a bad idea. We're going to go back to my original plan. And if you remember, God moved away from Saul and transitioned his thoughts on this young shepherd boy who probably wasn't old enough to be considered an adult since, his... All right, let me tell you the whole story. So Samuel comes to Jesse, who's a guy in Benjamin, which belongs to, or not Benjamin, Bethlehem, which is one of the towns in Judah, which is the right tribe to be looking for a king. And he says, hey, you have 7 sons, don't you? And he's like, yeah. It's like, let me see them, because I think God is choosing one of your sons to be the king. And there's the firstborn, and the firstborn looks amazing. He, again, must have looked the part. He was handsome, he was smart, and God says, no, not that guy. Secondborn, also handsome, also smart, also tall and everything. No, not that guy either. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And then all of a sudden Jesse's out of sons. And Samuel's like, do you have any other kids? Any other sons anywhere? And Jesse's like, oh yeah, I got my 7th born. But he's out in the fields, like he's watching sheep. Like I didn't even think you would want him. And the implication is he's just a kid. Right? He's maybe a teenager. He can handle some responsibility, but he's not ready to be the king of Israel. Are you kidding me? And Samuel's like, bring him in anyway. We'll just look at him. Well, God, they bring him in, and God points him out right away. It says, hey, this kid, this David guy, he's the one. He's the one. And how did Samuel show David that he was the one? He took oil that he had specially prepared. He took oil and he anointed the head of David. He poured it out over his head, and it kind of spilled down onto his shoulders and onto his body. This is a typical thing God would do for priests and also for kings to kind of set them apart as being important people in God's plan. The anointed one. Remember the whole Messiah thing? come back to that later. So let me give you the blanks here, make sure I get them right. So Saul quickly proved by his actions that he wasn't cut out to be king, and God took the kingdom, that's the blank there, God took the kingdom from him and gave it to a shepherd boy from the tribe of Judah named David. Now this seems like a strange choice at first, until there's a 9-foot giant leading the armies of Philistia who invade Israel and are about to send the entire army running, shrieking in fear through the land. And this teenager, shepherd boy, with a rock, kills the most fearsome warrior that the Philistines had. You've heard of the David and Goliath story. He kills him with a slingshot. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, whoa, this kid is destined for great things. Saul even sees it. And Saul pulls him into the army and gives him authority over some of the army. And then he keeps winning battles and winning battles and winning battles. Pretty soon, Saul realizes this is who God wants to replace me. Saul's not cool with that, so Saul hunts David down, and David escapes. And for years, David is a king in exile waiting to be crowned king, but the current guy won't get the message and step aside like he's supposed to. And so finally, Saul dies in battle, and then David basically is crowned king a couple of years later. He has to fight a little bit of a civil war against Saul's army to kind of take control of the whole country. But within a couple of years of Saul's death, David is crowned the king in Jerusalem. And the funny thing is, it's been about 20 years since he was first anointed king as a boy. And now here he is as a grown man, a warrior par excellence, a guy who knows how to fight when he's outnumbered, as well as a guy who knows how to fight at the head of a huge army. And he now begins the process of fighting wars against all of Israel's enemies. Because at this time, because of Saul's weak leadership and the people's idolatry against God, the nations around Israel were encroaching upon her boundaries. And so David says, none of that, not on my watch. And he takes out the army and he starts defeating Israel's enemies one at a time. And what he does is he's expanding the borders of the kingdom, and he's also subjugating her enemies. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. That's the historical context for the covenant that I'm about to share with you. David is the right guy from the right tribe, chosen by God because his heart was different from Saul's heart. He was a man after God's own heart. He was going to do it God's way. He was going to work hard to stick to the covenant agreement, the lease agreement in the land, and David would be the kind of leader who would lead the people to do the same thing. Okay? So because of that, God has chosen David, and now here David is, and he's finally established in his home, and then David gets an idea. He gets an idea. Now, let me give you a couple of blanks here. So you guys know that I have sort of, probably unfairly to David, I have shown a bright, shining light on many of the issues that David faced as a man. He was not pristine. He was not perfect. He was not a guy with clean hands completely. In fact, he has blood all over his hands. And in many ways, he failed to live up to this standard of the Mosaic Covenant and the lease agreement. However, David's heart was different in that when you confronted David on his sin, he didn't cover it up. He exposed it, and he repented, and he turned back to God. And that is the secret of his greatness, okay? And so David, yeah, he had his issues, but his heart was different from Saul's. And so he's sitting in his established kingdom. He doesn't have any enemies to fight, doesn't have any armies to send out. For once, he has peace. And what is the first thing that pops into his head? The first thing that pops into his head is he thinks about building God a house. That's the blank there. Building God a house. Now, temples were really important in the ancient world, right? Ancient peoples thought that the gods needed places to shelter while on earth. They had they probably had their palaces up in, heaven or whatever spirit realm they lived in, but they needed to have visible places where they could connect with their people, the people who followed them and the people who offered them sacrifices and kept them happy, stuff like that, who fed them, according to some of the ancient thinkers in the ancient world. And so they would build these temples all over the place. Well, God didn't have a temple. There was no permanent structure. Now, there was the thing called the tabernacle. If you remember that, it's a tent. A fancy tent, mind you, but a tent. And the tent would travel around from place to place, and the priests would travel with it, and the priests would allow the people to have their sacrifices. And the sacrifices would work this covenant out and would allow for the men and women, children to be forgiven and have their covenant relationship restored, because everybody was fail at the lease agreement. But when they realized their failures and came to God to fix it, the tabernacle was the place where you would fix it, right? And David's like, okay, I'm living here in this lush palace of cedar. And that's a big deal. Cedar had to be brought in from hundreds of miles away. This is a big deal. David's like, look, I got everything I need. I am perfectly satisfied. I'm perfectly settled. I'm rich. I'm powerful. I've got everything I need. And the God who gave me everything is living in a tent? No. This can't be. This can't be. I need to build God a house. So turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is where the covenant happens. And I know I've sort of talked to you about this before, but let's go into detail. Verse 1. Now, when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all this that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." So Nathan's like, oh, I see what you're getting at, David. You want to build God a permanent structure. You want to build God a house. You want to give God a place that's his own, that's lush and beautiful, as maybe even more beautiful than the palace for you. Nathan thinks this is a great idea. This is a great plan. Go for it, and God is with you. Now, Nathan didn't actually run that opinion by God first. He sort of just assumed that God would be happy with it. Look at verse 4. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" In other words, God's like, look, hold on a second. See, because there's two ways you can look at this. You can see it as, wow, David's really nice. He wants to give God this cool present. Or you can look at it as David is trying to create and put pressure on God and leverage and say, hey, God, I'm pretty cool. I'm pretty important. I think I'll build you a place to live. And I'll even let you live there. Aren't you lucky that I'm here to build this place for you? And God says, look, David, if that's what you're getting at, if that's what's in your heart, that you kind of want to have a pet God that you can go visit anytime you want, that's not how this works. I've been perfectly happy to travel around from place to place in a tent with my people Israel, and I've never asked anybody to build me a house, because frankly, you can't build me a house. Yeah, you can set up a structure, but if I don't choose to live there and bless it, it's just a building. It's empty. It's nothing. You cannot manipulate me. You cannot force me into a corner. You cannot make me your pet. But then he says something really cool. Take a look at verse 8. "Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you." So in other words, God is saying, look, David, I know you think you're doing me a favor here, but who's been doing who favors your whole life long? David, your victories are not because you're a superior military strategist, or you're stronger than the other guy, or you're smarter. The reason you've won is because I have given you success. So in other words, who is in charge of who? Who owes everything to who, right? You owe everything to me, David. I don't owe you a thing. And then he says this, though. This is really cool. Verse 9. "I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you," check this out, this is the important part, "that the Lord will make you a house." Now you're like, what? David doesn't need a house, right? He's living in his house. He already has a house. He's got a palace. It's made of cedar. It's a pretty nice place. He doesn't need an upgrade. What are you talking about, God? God says, no, you don't understand. There's two ways to understand the word house. Yes, there's a physical dwelling, but house also can represent a household of people. Take a look at verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom for how long? Forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from who? Saul. So what God is doing is God is going back to the history. He's like, look, you remember how I started things off with Saul and I let him be king for a while? And then when he broke the Mosaic Covenant and when he showed that he wasn't ready for the job that I had for him, I took it away from him and gave it to you. Well, guess what, David? I could do the same thing to you. I could take this right to rule away and give it to whoever else I want to. Literally anybody else. Anybody else. Why? Because I'm the person who decides who the king is, because I'm in charge and you're not. You're under my authority, right? You're just David. Love you, David. You're great, but you're just David. You're just some kid that I pulled out of a sheepfold somewhere to be the shepherd of my people Israel. Okay? I can give it to anybody that I want, but here's the deal, David. You want something? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to make a covenant. I'm going to make you promises. And here's that promise. The promise is that I am going to establish not just your kingdom during your lifetime. That would be a huge blessing. But I'm going to take your son, and then I'm going to establish him. And then I'm going to establish his family group forever, so that his descendants will always have the right to rule my people Israel. David isn't getting a building, a house, someplace to live. He's already got that. What he's getting from God is the promise of a dynasty of his children who will always have the right to shepherd his people Israel, to serve as the king over his country, over his people, over the descendants of Abraham. He's going to be the guy, and his family now is going to be selected by God to be the ones who are going to consistently have the opportunity to lead the children of Israel, to obey God, and to move into this Mosaic Covenant, and to help them to keep the conditions of the lease agreement. So let me just kind of go over this though. God responds by making a covenant with David and his descendants, in which he makes many promises. Now, I read some of them for you already, but I'm just going to review them really quickly, okay? Verse 9, he says this, right? I will make for you a great name. Like, what does he say in verse 9? Like the name of the great ones of the earth. I think that's already been fulfilled, hasn't it? I mean, most cultures have some awareness, if they've been influenced by the Bible at all, and a lot of cultures have across the world, outside of Eastern cultures perhaps. Most of the cultures in the world have a knowledge of who this King David is. Even if it's just the story of David and Goliath, they understand there was something different about this guy. I mean, David, how common is the name David in just the United States of America and Western countries? It's huge because he's a lion, literally, amongst sheep. I mean, he is like the granddaddy, the greatest king of all. In fact, God consistently uses David as the benchmark for all future kings. All future kings are measured by how well they measured up to the heart that David had. So God already has fulfilled this part of it. He's given David a great name, like the names of the great ones in the earth. But then also in verse 10, he says this. Verse 10, I'll appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, right? So basically God is acknowledging like, hey, look, ever since the time of the judges, there have been invaders that have come in here and taken over and done this and done that. And then Israel had to rise up with a judge, and then they kicked out the bad guys, and then they started over again. And God's like, look, as a part of this dynasty, here's something I promise to you. As a part of this thing, I promise you that I'm going to plant Israel in her place, and she's going to be safe from all of her enemies. There are going to be enemies, but they're not going to rise up against her like they used to. They're not going to just kind of run willy-nilly through her land and take what they want. They're going to be dependent upon, and basically God is going to protect them from all of their enemies. And they're going to have a safe, secure place. And then verse 11, he says, I'm also going to give you rest from all your enemies. And then the last part, the one that's most important, is this. So a great name, a place for Israel to be planted and not disturbed, rest from all her enemies, and here we go, an eternal dynasty. An eternal dynasty. Look at verse 14. He says, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. Did you catch that? God is saying, look, that doesn't give your kids some, get out of jail free card where they don't have to follow the Mosaic Covenant because I've made this promise to them. No. If they break the Mosaic Covenant, I'm going to punish them. They're going to wish in some cases they had never been born because I'm going to strike them with stripes. Like I'm going to whip them. I'm going to beat them into submission. So in other words, God's not saying, hey, look, you guys have a blank check. Just live any old way you want and we'll be good because I made promises to David. No, God's like, no. If they walk away from me, if they commit iniquity, if they break the lease agreement, I am going to make their lives a living nightmare. I'm going to chase after them. I'm going to give them losses to their enemies. I'm going to make their life miserable. But this is the key part. Verse 15, but my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, I'm not sure about this, but I think I heard a word repeated a few times there in just a few verses. And that word, of course, right, is forever. In fact, if you look in the entire chapter, forever is repeated 6 times. Forever, 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 and forever. This thing that God is promising David is not a temporary thing. This is what leads me to the last blank here of this section. This is an unconditional covenant. In other words, this is just like the Abrahamic Covenant. The decision to start this covenant, to use David's family as the ones who will always have the right to rule over the kingdom of Israel, this promise that God has given is an unconditional covenant. How do I know this? Because if David's sons mess up, if David's sons break the lease agreement, if David's sons lead the people to break the lease agreement, and guess what? The vast majority of them would. So bad that at some point God has to hit the exile clause and kick everybody out of the land completely. That was on David's kids' watch. And we'll talk about that next week. But even if they do that, even if they do the worst, even if they're the worst possible kings they could be, that doesn't mean that God's going to cut them off and go pick somebody else to be the king. Their children will still have the right to step up into that place. And one of the things I love about the story of the kings of Judah, if you want some fascinating reading for your devotional time, read through 1st and 2nd Kings, or even 1st and 2nd Chronicles that really focuses on the sons of David. What you'll see is generations that walk away from God, and then their sons wake up one day and go, you know what? I don't want to live like my dad did. I don't want to lead the people away from God like my grandfather did. I want to lead people like my father David did. And they would return to God. My oldest son's name is Josiah, named after, in my mind, my favorite son of David, Josiah. Josiah, his grandfather was the most wicked king Judah had ever seen. He was so wicked, he actually sacrificed his own kids in the fire to a foreign god named Molech. Like princes. He would actually usually the princes kind of go find the poor people, and the poor people suffer for the wills of the princes and the kings. Well, this guy was so radical in his commitment to foreign gods, he killed some of his own kids to please this god who was deaf and dumb and mute and couldn't do a thing for him. Powerless. Didn't even exist. That's how bad his grandfather was. His grandfather was the reason that ultimately God decides to hit the exile clause, because Manasseh, he took us too far. You can't come all the way back from that. Sorry, you got to leave. You've broken the lease agreement the worst you possibly can for the last time. And then Manasseh dies, his son Ammon takes over, and 15 minutes later, I mean, he's so bad, 15 minutes later, his own people conspire against him and assassinate him, okay? Literally in like the first year of his kingdom. Like they can see the train wreck coming so bad, his own people kill him, all right? And then a bunch of people get together, get rid of the guys who killed him, and decide they're gonna put 8-year-old Josiah as the king of Judah. 8-year-old Josiah who does not have, he probably is still learning how to read. He's probably still making his way through reading the Mosaic Covenant for the first time. He's a kid. He doesn't have a father to lead him or even a grandfather to go to for advice. He's completely on his own with whatever advisors he can trust. And who can you really trust as an 8-year-old? Who's going to take you seriously as an 8-year-old and try to teach you the truth? Well, somebody did, because as a young man, Josiah, 15, 16 years old, he dedicated himself to become like his father David. And God said, you know what? I know Manasseh was a train wreck. His son Ammon was heading that way too. But this boy Josiah, he is in the line of David. And so you know what? I'm going to give him every chance to be a good king. And God gives him a chance to be a good king. And for 31 years, he held off the exile with his holiness and with his determination to lead the people to obey the lease agreement. And God said, look, yeah, they're going into exile, but I'm going to delay it during your lifetime, Josiah, because you're the one who has the right. Why? Because hundreds of years before, he made a covenant with David and said, David, even if your sons are idiots, and they will be idiots at many points along the way, David, you're going to be an idiot at a few points along the way. I'm not going to take away my covenant with you. I'm not going to invalidate it. I'm not going to break it. Now, the Mosaic Covenant, if you break it at some point, you get all the curses. Here, he's like, nope, this is unconditional. Your sons will have it forever, forever and ever and ever. Okay, so here's the summary of the covenant, the way God makes it here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Okay, summary of the covenant. God is eternally committed to using David's family, you could say sons if you like, David's family as the rightful kings of the nation who will bless all the families of the earth. David and his descendants will always have that right. Now remember, that goes all the way back to Genesis where Joseph, or excuse me, all the J's. Jacob said that the scepter will be in Judah's camp forever, right? And then you have the law that says, hey, this is how he's going to behave. And then God officially gives it to David. And then he makes this covenant. He says, David, you're not going to build me a house, okay? I love you, but you don't have anything to give me that I don't already have myself. Yes, I will let your son one day build me a house, and my presence will fill this house. Fine. But you don't build me anything. Let me build you a house. David, it was wonderful that you wanted to build me a house. I love your heart. And it's your heart that I'm making these pledges to. And these pledges are going to include a great name. It's going to include rest for the people from all the enemies, right? If a king's doing his job, there's not enemies from the outside threatening the people. If a shepherd, right, is protecting the sheep, you don't have to worry about the wolves every 5 seconds. So David, don't worry. I'm going to give you success. If your kids run away from me, I'm going to punish them, but I'm not going to abandon them. I'm not going to kick them out. David, this is an eternal, unconditional covenant. So I'm putting it here underneath descendants because David is the one who is going to be the leader of the people that God has to spread throughout the land. And his kids are going to share in that. Now, next week, when we come back, we're going to talk about, okay, so how did this all play out? How did it all play out in real time? How did David's descendants do with this? And what impact did this have on the expectation that the people had about some of these unfulfilled promises in the Mosaic Covenant? Okay? So come back next week. We'll wrap up the Davidic Covenant and point out its importance to old-time end events. Old-time end events? No. End-time Old Testament events. All right? So we'll see you next week. Lord bless you guys. Yes, I'm on vacation, and I'm sure I'm having a wonderful time. I'll talk to you guys next week. Bye-bye.